Hi, everyone, and welcome to the first of our three-part Enterprise Multi-Cloud webinar series, sponsored by IT Pro Today. Today's webcast, Multi-Cloud, a primer for enterprise journey to optimal workload performance, is sponsored by Snapt. If you have any technical difficulties during today's session, please press the Help widget on your player console to receive assistance in solving common issues. If you're having audio difficulties or issues with advancing of the slides, please hit your F5 key to refresh your webcast console. Today's web seminar is being recorded and will be available for 12 months on demand starting tomorrow. You'll receive an email when it is ready. Please feel free to submit any questions you may have for our speakers today via the Q&A widget on your screen. Our speakers today are Alan Howard, Principal Analyst, Cloud and Data Center Research Practice at Omdia, and Dave Blakey, Co-CEO and CTO of Snapt. And with that, the floor is yours, Alan.
Thanks very much, Jen. Appreciate the introduction. As Jen said, I can't help but to repeat this every time I start a webinar, but my name is Alan Howard. I'm a Principal Analyst in the Cloud and Data Center Research Practice at Omdia. For those of you that may not be aware, Omdia is the research division within Informa Tech. We were formed by the merger of IHS Markit, Ovum, and Tractica. We have about 350 analysts that service mostly the IT world. I'm pleased to be joined today by Dave Blakey. Dave, would you like to say hello to everyone?
Yes, thank you. Hello, and good morning and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dave Blakey, as mentioned, and I will give a little bit more background to myself, I think maybe after Alan's turn, but glad to be here and looking forward to hearing from you, Alan.
Great. Thanks, Dave. So today is just part one of a three-part series. So we'll be spending some time today up front in this first webinar, setting the stage regarding the multi-cloud world, its adoption, its drivers, and then dig in and talk about infrastructure distribution and managing workloads that run across geographically distributed infrastructure. So at Omdia, as you might imagine, we do a lot of studies. And this particular data point is from a study called the ICT Enterprise Insights Study, where we study 6,000 organizations around the world. And the data point is obviously that on average, 35% of an organization's workloads run in the cloud, which is up 10% from just 2 years ago. To sort of set the stage in terms of how healthy the cloud market is, in our revenue tracking of cloud service providers, we're forecasting a 16.6% compound annual growth rate over the next 5 years out through 2025. To illustrate that a little bit more clearly, in 2019, cloud service provider revenue was $250 billion. And in 2020, just the next year, it was $328 billion, an increase of $78 billion in 1 year, essentially a 30% year-over-year growth rate. So the market is quite healthy. So this is another study we did. This was fielded in Q3 of 2020. This is a study of co-location customers in North America. And what we asked them was, where are your workloads running? What % of your workloads run in the cloud as opposed to co-location and on-prem? And in 2020, the number was coincidentally exactly the same, 35%. What's interesting about this data is that for the co-location users, they're going from 35% in the base year of 2020 and anticipating that by 2022, that's going to drop to 30%. So while some people might find that seemingly alarming, that doesn't really alarm me. I think that, the thing is that for many reasons, organizations are looking at their workloads off in the future and deciding, this one I think is going to be better running on our own infrastructure. And also, as the longer organizations work with cloud workloads, the better they are able to rationalize where those workloads are going to live the best, if you will. So that drop from 35 to 30% doesn't mean the organizations are using less cloud resources or spending less on cloud. They're just rationalizing where their workloads are going to live. So to sort of level set, in terms of definitions, if you will, hybrid cloud is essentially an organization's private cloud in conjunction with public cloud services. And so the public cloud side is typically used for customer engagement, and the private cloud is where the system of record, application dependencies, and sensitive data live. Multi-cloud is simply a single organization using two or more cloud service providers. I think that's one of the things that's most critical about operating in a multi-cloud environment is the network connectivity to make it all hum and work smoothly to support all of your customers, and also the management of all those different cloud providers that you're using simultaneously. And in my chart here, I say often chooses you. I'm going to talk about that in more detail in a few slides here. Evolving cloud architectures are sort of an unknown. My illustration on the right implies multi-cloud, multiple cloud service providers in use, and maybe multiple private clouds. But I think the reality is that as organizations go through the process of architecting solutions, they'll use a variety of different services, and what cloud architectures might look like in 2, 3, 4 years is not really something that, we can comfortably define right at this moment. By the way, when I talk about cloud services, just to be clear, I'm including infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and software as a service. So looking at hybrid and multi-cloud adoption, this is yet another study. This is a study of cloud service provider customers in North America, again, fielded in Q3 of 2020. On the left is hybrid cloud, which enjoys a little bit more popularity, probably essentially just based on history. So hybrid cloud is growing from the base year 2020 at 56% to what respondents anticipate will be 71% in the target year, which is 2022. And then multi-cloud, quite a bit less, about 25% less, but growing at roughly about the same rate. So 31% in 2020, anticipating 44% in 2022. So 15% growth for hybrid cloud and 13% growth for multi-cloud. So of those multi-cloud users, we asked them, how many cloud service providers are you using? So on the left is now, which is actually 2020. So that's the base year, indicating they were using an average of 13 cloud service providers, growing to 18, anticipating 18 service providers by 2022. So when I talk to customers about this data, they're surprised at how big these numbers are. And I guess the first thing I would say is that, typically this is larger organizations that experience, what I'll call cloud sprawl, the use of multiple cloud providers. But the other thing I would share is that, when I think about where I work at Informa, we have over 10,000 employees. And when I look at my own browser, I have roughly 10 links to cloud-based services that help me manage my day-to-day work and manage my relationship, with my employer. So I don't find these big numbers particularly surprising to me anyway. Dave, have you seen the same sort of thing in terms of these kinds of numbers?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that on average, across, say, SMEs, mid-size, and enterprise, the numbers are high. I think enterprises, this is completely believable. We deal with enterprises that could have 50 locations around the world, right? So, they really bring the number up. So I would absolutely say, certainly for enterprises, I can certainly believe it.
Yeah. So what makes multi-cloud a destination? This is kind of a high-level, basic laundry list. I'm sure there's a lot more, but this is what I could comfortably fit on a slide. But a few highlights, I think, from my perspective. And so it enables choice using multi-cloud. And the thing is that the cloud service providers are innovating constantly, bringing new services to market, enhancing the way that their customers can work, in cloud environments and even work within multi-cloud environments. And so when I think about, say an organization's research and development and engineering department, in contrast to, say, the sales department or the HR department, enterprises want to be able to cherry pick which services they use. So they might lean on Google for their artificial intelligence and machine learning capabilities. They might prefer AWS for their infrastructure as a service, and then lean on, say, Salesforce or Dynamics for sales and Workday for HR. So it's all about cherry picking the best services to solve the problems that you're trying to solve. Reliability, I think, is super important. A lot of the cloud providers have obviously developed ways of being able to fail over in multiple regions, offering backup and disaster recovery services. Multi-cloud chooses you, as I mentioned before. And so I think obvious, as I've been implying here so far, you just sort of sprawl out. You adopt different cloud service providers to meet certain needs. And then mergers and acquisitions. You merge with a company, and yesterday you had WebEx, today you have WebEx and Teams. And yesterday you had Office 365, and now you have Office 365 and Google Workplace. So that can obviously increase the number of cloud service providers. And it's not always easy to just migrate away over the next few weeks once the merger is done. I mean, those activities can, can take years. And then shadow IT. I mean, this has always been a fun subject, in enterprise IT departments. The sales department doesn't like, the way that they're working with their clients. And so, they go out and they get Salesforce. And eventually, sometimes that stuff comes home to roost in the IT department. And then cost savings. One of the big stories has been for years now that, you don't know what you're getting into with cloud, but there are cost savings to be had, assuming that, you've analyzed what you're trying to do and really understand the implications of renting it in the cloud and what those costs might be. But there is cost savings still to be had in the right circumstances. Avoiding vendor lock-in. I find this one interesting because vendor lock-in has historically been, it's too hard for me to move and they keep raising my prices. Well, it's not really a story about price anymore because as a general rule, cloud service providers are very price competitive. The issue with vendor lock-in is generally brought on by ourselves as we take some workloads or applications and scale them to a point where all of a sudden moving them becomes very difficult. It's kind of similar to the way the colocation market works, right? So you put in 5 cabinets, before you know it, you got 40 cabinets, but the risk of taking those 40 cabinets and moving them somewhere else is so high, I'll bear with the cost increases in that particular scenario. Anyway, same kind of thing in terms of scaling and that making it more difficult to move. So workload portability and interoperability is very achievable, but it's a story about application design and implementation. So the cloud providers have made it, at least many of them, such that you can have portable workloads, but it's all about, how they're designed and implemented to begin with. And then finally, workload performance. While the cloud service providers are facilitating some of that, they can't facilitate all of it. So if I like, Amazon, and I decide that I'm going to be in 2 regions, but I need infrastructure in a country where Amazon doesn't live, then that's what I need to use, either another cloud service provider or my own IT infrastructure in a co-location data center. And then challenges and solutions. this is a super high level, just kind of barely touching on it list. That's really the point of this 3-webinar series, is to go through in more detail challenges and solutions. So I'm not going to talk about these individually, but what I'll interject is 2 things. Is that, for each project that you endeavor on, the challenges and solutions will be unique to that project. And so, this is a little catch-all slide, but depending on what you're trying to do, all different kinds of challenges. But the other thing that I haven't even addressed is, one of the big challenges that enterprises face is, in order to be able to take advantage of some of these solutions, as opposed to, reworking legacy applications or inadequate applications, is upgrading my own internal IT infrastructure. So whether that's expanding a data center, expanding the network connectivity that comes into your on-prem data center, those things are very expensive and very time-consuming and very complex. And I guess what I'm leading into is an argument that the ecosystem of solutions between cloud, colocation, and network providers has evolved to a point where that decision on whether or not to expand and upgrade your own infrastructure is a very serious discussion to be assessed. So, as I just said, distribution of infrastructure is really all about, where you want your workloads and your data to live. And I think that, essentially one of the decisions that has to be made, once you decide on where do I want my workloads to live and my data to live from a geographic standpoint is, do I require, is public cloud infrastructure adequate for what I'm doing? Am I comfortable with that? Or do I need private cloud infrastructure? And that leads me to the choice. I can either build something in South Africa, or I can lean on a colocation provider, or I can either install my own IT gear for workloads or private cloud, or however you want to architect it, or I can drop in a set of Amazon Outpost racks or Microsoft Stack racks, or some of the other providers that provide those hardware solutions. So in terms of the overall network of solutions, I think about it in sort of a 3-tier way, if you will. And so what we're looking at here is a map of the data centers. This comes from the Omdia Cloud and Colocation Data Center Building Tracker. So within this building tracker, we track about 30 of the top cloud and colocation service providers. So on the cloud side, it'd be Amazon, Microsoft, Google, IBM, SAP, Oracle, Alibaba, Tencent, Baidu, and so on and so forth. And on the colocation side, it's, Digital, Equinix, CyrusOne, QTS, Switch, Global Switch, and a variety of others. So on the left-hand side is the whole world. It doesn't look like there's very many data centers, but those pins are all on top of each other because they're loaded up into dense population centers. But overall, there's about 2,500 pins for those cloud and colocation data centers. And on the right, I've kind of zoomed in on Western Europe so you can get a better idea of how they're dispersed throughout that area. So that's the first line of defense. That's the first place where your infrastructure can go if you don't feel like bearing the cost of building your own. The next step in the 3 tiers, if you will, is how the whole world gets connected together. And so this is a map of submarine cables. It's much like the data center map in that if I were to zoom right in, you would see that the density of cable landings, particularly in the large population areas, say, London to New York, or say Los Angeles and San Francisco to Singapore and Hong Kong is really quite dense. But it's the submarine cables that really connect together the continents and country to country on those continents that makes global network communications at the speeds and latency requirements that we typically need. That's what makes it possible. And then finally, this is a map of the internet exchange points. So it looks similar to the data center map, but it's much more dense. And so we have the physical infrastructure or data centers around the globe, the submarine cables connecting them together. And then on the ground, it's the terrestrial networks, fiber and copper running through these countries that connects everything else together. And so in terms of how we access all that, it's the co-location providers around the globe that really provide the best access to that whole ecosystem of networks. So the co-location data centers, essentially they provide access to a number of different network providers, some many more than others, cross connects from your infrastructure to their infrastructure to give you that network access, direct connections to the cloud service providers, in some cases dedicated ports, blended bandwidth, things of that nature. So it's really the hub of the greater network ecosystem for the management of workloads. And the more progressive co-location providers also offer dashboards or portals for their customers, where they can now manage their interconnection services, and in some cases provision network services in real time. The other, I think, pretty close to a game changer is the advent of third-party software-defined networking service providers, right? So Epsilon, Megaport, Packet Fabric, Unitas are good examples of that. There's, a smattering of others around. But these companies are very fascinating because they live generally in co-location data centers. And one would think that, well, that would be competitive, that they're providing network services as is the co-location provider. But what they've developed is this sort of partner ecosystem. And so some of these companies have POPs all around the globe and now are providing a way to access all of those other networks through these software-defined networking services. So they provide, direct cloud connections, network connections, internet exchange point access, which is, of course, where a lot of the peering occurs between service providers. And the other thing that's really fascinating about this is that as an enterprise, if I have an on-prem data center, say in Philadelphia, and I want to get access to, say, Packet Fabric so that I can get broader access across the globe, I don't necessarily have to have cabinets in that colo data center. These companies can often acquire a point-to-point connection from your on-prem data center directly into their cage or set of cabinets, and then provide you that dashboard or portal kind of capability of provisioning network services to support whatever your needs might be. So that's the whole, ecosystem. And essentially what we've done here is, I hope, illustrated that regardless of what your multi-cloud sort of focus is, the infrastructure options are there, and they've become much more competitive and, as a general rule, way less expensive to exploit these resources as opposed to developing them on your own. So that was quite a bit of rambling. Dave, I'll bet you're chomping at the bit. Are you ready for me to turn it over to you?
Yes, sure. Thank you very much, Alan. These are some great insights, actually. I think a lot of good points for exactly what I'm probably about to talk about. So that'll be perfect. So yes, let me take over. As promised, I can give you a little bit more background on me. Like I mentioned, my name is Dave Blakey, of course, and I work at Snapt. We're an application delivery and security company. So in simple terms, we are concerned and care about the performance, availability, and security of websites, web apps, APIs, etc. What that means in relation to this is that we deal with a large number of different types of deployments and different types of clients that are concerned about, delivering their services and applications globally. And we're seeing a huge boom in multi-cloud, as well as the complexities that come with it and the opportunities that come with it, really. So what I'm going to talk about And please remember, obviously, there is a Q&A section, and I'm happy to answer any questions that do come in if I skip over anything. But the three main things I want to talk about is just in practical terms, why our clients are choosing multi-cloud, what we're seeing as a general kind of trend, what some of the challenges we're seeing are, and then a preview of the next topic, right? So we're doing this 3-webinar series, and in the next one, we will go through, some of the ways to solve those problems, how to architect for multi-cloud in a more efficient way, etc. So the main point of this one will be getting everyone to terms with really why organizations are choosing the opportunities of multi-cloud, but also kind of being forced into multi-cloud in many cases, and where some of those challenges are. So first thing first, let's talk about why multi-cloud and why organizations are choosing it and how many are choosing it, right? So I think let me define multi-cloud as I tend to speak about it. It means a couple of different things. It means different cloud providers. But when we talk about the challenges and the design and architecture, it really means having workloads in more than one cloud provider or location, right? Having workloads in Amazon, in US East and US West can pose a lot of the same challenges. You have multiple data centers that are physically very distant, things like that. So it can be slightly less complex than different cloud providers, but I'm including hybrid clouds, different co-location centers, a mix of public and private cloud, and kind of everything in between there. And the general term I use is multi-cloud, which is to say that an organization has some workloads in multiple places and everything above that, right? Now, when we look at our clients, we're seeing 81% when we look at our data are using 2 or more locations, right? So typically those are cloud providers. As mentioned, sometimes it can be on-premise and public cloud or multiple locations in a single public cloud. But generally speaking, it will be multiple cloud providers. And there are many reasons why organizations are doing this. So I've selected a couple to talk about in specific. I think the first one that stands out to me is what I've called freedom here, which is the freedom to really use the best possible cloud for each workload or task, deployment, or service that you want to take to market. And the best possible cloud can be defined in so many different ways, but you're looking at, from physical limitations, as Alan mentioned, distance to your clients, right? That's a big uptick that we're seeing in requirements from enterprises and mid-sized businesses as well, is how close can they get their data center to their actual physical users. And in many cases, that means in multiple places around the world. I'm from South Africa, and that's a good example. Until recently, the only tier 1 cloud provider with a data center in South Africa was Azure. So if you had AWS infrastructure and you needed to deploy into South Africa, it had to be in Azure, right? So freedom in that space. But also, you must remember that I think in 2019, Amazon launched 1,800 new products. And the other cloud providers are not shy either. There are different services with different strengths and weaknesses on different cloud providers. And the best service for your application, A, may be different than application B. A good point Alan also mentioned is that sometimes you inherit an infrastructure that's elsewhere, merger, acquisition, things like that. So really, I think the idea that, the application or the service should decide the environment that it needs and the requirements that it has, and not be restricted by the DevOps or SecOps team's ability to orchestrate and deploy things. And a multi-cloud strategy is really enabling of that. The second point is price. And the various cloud providers have different prices for different services. Now, Alan made a good point about, that there is quite a price war between them all. But when you look at new services, when you look at things like containerization, machine learning, there are often quite large differences between cloud providers. And especially when you look at things like egress costs, right? Like the cost of data, things like that. There can be big variances, right? And being locked into one particular cloud provider that charges a large fee in a certain area for egress data, or an app doesn't belong well in that infrastructure, can cause a large escalation in price. You'll see that I also mentioned price as a challenge later on, so we'll talk about pricing and costs a bit more. The biggest point I think, when we speak to our clients is resilience, right? So when I talk about that, I'm talking about high availability and geographic high availability, right? So typically concerns that we see in what we would call the co-location type of deployment. But as you all know, I mean, just yesterday, US East, Amazon had an outage. We saw OVH had an outage recently. DigitalOcean had an outage last month. Cloud providers do have outages, right? As does everybody. But, it's far more resilient to use different providers for your services, your business critical services, especially ones where you have, SLAs and, 5 nines or 100% uptime guarantees on services. Having a multi-cloud strategy is very enabling of that, being able to move between cloud providers. And being able to move between them quite frequently is an interesting thing as well. Speaking of interesting use cases, we have a client whose cloud bill is, $5 to $7 million a month. And they will move between cloud providers large amounts of resources depending on what the instance pricing looks like at the time, or what their service pricing will look like. And a 10% saving to them could be, hundreds of thousands of dollars, right? So what multi-cloud is really about is designing your applications and deployment and architecture in a way that is actually enabling of that, right? If you were told tomorrow that you could no longer use your primary cloud provider for whatever reason, would it be simple to move to a secondary? And not designing in such a fashion can be quite a limiting factor later on, right? So designing for resilience, avoiding lock-in, so protect against a restricted business model because you're stuck in a single cloud. Like I said, that can be for all the other points, right? So if you're locked into a single vendor because you're dependent on their services, then you cannot deploy to another data center because it's closer in the last mile, or you cannot do simple things even like CI/CD environments. It can often be very frustrating because your CI/CD or DR environments don't actually mirror your production environments because they're using native cloud services, right? So, your load balancer in your production environment is not the same as your one in test or things like that. So having these neutral kind of architectures, helps to prevent that type of lock-in and restriction on what you can do and where you can deploy. And then network and performance. So, this is a stat I use in a lot of different presentations, if I'm honest, but, they say 90% of the world's data is only 2 years old. And the kind of massive increase in scale that we've seen, especially over the last 2 years with everything that's been going on. But, we're seeing far more endpoint services, servers, containers, traffic, and requests from clients than ever before, right? There's been a massive uptick, and not a doubling, but like 10 times more. So there's this vast kind of increase in the requirements and demands. And that leads to scaling concerns and being able to leverage multiple locations or clouds, or, when I say multiple locations, right, you could be on-premise or in a custom data center, bursting to public cloud. It could be certain services you offload to public cloud or to different clouds. Like I said, very efficient often to have local cloud providers, right? So we work with businesses that will say have presence in China, Europe, and North America, and they may use different cloud providers in those areas, things like that. So really, I think people are designing and architecting now for scale, and ensuring that you are able to benefit from different clouds and their strengths in local territories is quite important in that case as well. So in summary, what we're seeing honestly is that multi-cloud is being used by a majority of organizations that we deal with. There's very few that have everything tucked in isolation in a single environment. Maybe SMEs, yeah, but mid-size and up, it's very unlikely that they have, just US East 1, and that's where every single service can live and can always exist. So multi-cloud is very common. We're seeing it grow. We don't see it going anywhere. And like Alan mentioned, I think the number of environments and locations that clients are in is growing, right, significantly. Remember that multi-cloud, like I mentioned, means running in any number of locations, right? You have the same concerns if you're dealing with a private data center and a cloud as you do if you're dealing with two different clouds. And of course, because our entire business is built around, making sure people's sites stay online and are secure, we obviously think the resilience aspect of it is a good idea, right? So we're personally advising people to have multi-cloud strategy in order to mitigate risk in all sorts of ways, right? I think I've gone through quite a lot of the risk points. Now, the next thing that I want to talk about, and to be clear, we'll be addressing a lot of the how you bypass these, how you can turn some of these into opportunities, or how you mitigate some of the challenges, are the challenges of the multi-cloud strategy, though, and what to expect, what to prepare yourself for if you're looking at deploying into multiple cloud environments or multiple locations, like I mentioned. And there are a few, again, here that I have highlighted from what we see from our client base and what we hear as challenges. So the first thing is that it's not that uncommon for us to find that clients are dependent on a service that a cloud provider provides, right? So you may have a cloud provider who you've developed tooling for. You use their API to provision services or virtual machines or, whatever it might be. You've got a deep stack that's tied into it. You're dependent on RDS or, whatever it might be, right? Some services that they provide. And it's difficult to untangle yourself from that. Now, not every deployment needs to be in every cloud, right? There are many applications at a business today, often many thousands of applications and services at businesses. And there are different considerations for different ones. But we will often run into clients that feel that they are already restricted in a single environment. And this is really a design problem. It's time, I think, now, if not already, to definitely start thinking about your designs in terms of enabling multi-cloud, being able to move them to multiple locations. When we talk about these types of things, you must remember things like edge compute, right? There's a very quick growing market, being able to put some of your workloads at the edge. We see that a lot with API providers and things like that want fast responding APIs in edge territories. They want workloads on the edge, etc. And, those are then not simple public clouds with, cloud native solutions and services, right? So that's the first thing that we run into. And depending on how deep the stack is, it can be quite a challenge to get away from that, of course. But businesses are deploying new applications all the time now. So I think generally my advice is, deploy new applications in a different way and learn by doing, because one of the points I'm going to mention is training. But the second one is security. This is something that's kind of dear to me, obviously, because it's a lot of what we do. But it can be challenging to manage security in multiple environments, right? When you've got different clouds, let's use Azure and AWS as a simple example. You have different firewalls in each, right, with different rule sets. And when you have humans managing two different clouds with two different rule sets, it lends itself to problems. That's a very simple example, but you can understand what I mean. The number of times I've seen a client fail over from production to their DR environment and something not work because the DR environment wasn't actually a replica of the production environment. We make a change to the firewall, or we disable TLS 1.2 and using TLS 1.3 now on our web servers or whatever, and then all of a sudden DR is not set the same, right? So changes were made that are not the same. And when you're multi-cloud, when it's active and not, a disaster recovery site that's typically passive, but you're actually routing traffic there, you need to be making changes simultaneously in all of these environments, especially around the security considerations. But then you also need to be monitoring them centrally, right? So you can't use embedded cloud solutions to monitor, your logs or security or, your machine learning type of techniques and things like that for advanced WAF deployments and so on. It can become very challenging when you've got different clouds, which is why we see a lot of clients obviously coming to vendors like ourselves or others for non-cloud native solutions that can work in multiple clouds. So it is a challenge, right, using these different native vendor solutions in different cloud environments. And it can get even more complex when you've got, very kind of spectrum-based workloads. So I often say to people that, we used to say, okay, hardware is dead. Everyone's going to have VMs. And then VMs were dead. Everyone was going to move to the cloud. Now people are trying to say, okay, clouds are dead. Everyone's going to move to containers. We're not going to use cloud instances, now we're using containers. And, there's some people saying containers are not going to go away, we're going to go serverless. But the real truth is that businesses need to have a spectrum of needs. There are workloads that are best on hardware, dedicated hardware. There are workloads that are best at the edge. There are workloads that are very well suited for Kubernetes. There are workloads that will stay on cloud instances for a long time. And when you look at a modern organization and you've got, VMware stack in your data center, you've got AWS, Azure, GCP, and DigitalOcean cloud providers, you've got hardware in an environment, then the challenge of security becomes quite significant, of course. Next thing is training. So staff experience with cloud. This is something that we run into as well. Staff will be familiar, your DevOps engineers and team and things like that will be familiar with AWS or Azure or GCP. And not as familiar with the others. And when you run different solutions in those environments, it can become more complex, right? So launching a virtual machine in any of the major cloud providers is relatively similar, easy to get there, right? But when you're talking about launching containers or having advanced gateway routing or things like that, it becomes very different and can require training, right? Can require upskilling. So that can also be hard. And like I mentioned on dependence, it's also about training your teams to work with multiple clouds, to consider that they, what cloud native features can they use and which ones would be available in any cloud and things like that. The next thing is cost. So depending on your design, if you think back to a traditional kind of high availability environment, if you needed 100% uptime, you needed disaster recovery, that meant you basically spent twice as much money on everything. Because everything that was in your production environment, you had to have a copy of it in your disaster recovery environment. And things become much worse when you're all over the globe. Clouds, I think, have mitigated that. But depending on your tooling and your capabilities and your environment and how you set things to scale and scale in and scale out, it can cause expenses, right, if they're not correctly set up. So this comes back to training as well, of course. You can configure clouds to scale up when they need to and scale down when you don't, and you can use services and things like that. And this is a lot of what we'll cover when we talk in our next session, right, how we do it and how our infrastructure is designed. But it can, on the face of it, be more expensive. If you run twice as many instances, it can cost twice as much, right? If you run 10 times as many, it can cost 10 times as much. So, designing in a way that mitigates that doesn't cause the cost to accelerate by leveraging multiple clouds, I think is critical. And then the final point on challenges is legacy solutions, right? So legacy solutions can be very challenging to move to the cloud or to move to a cloud native or multi-cloud environment. You can think of monolithic applications where it would be extremely difficult even for you just to have the applications in two environments because the database is not going to be shared between them, right? Or things like that. Environments where, authentication becomes a problem and all these types of things, right? Can I just swap between any of your servers? If I've logged into US East, can I just go to US West and will I just still be logged in? Or is that not the case? If I go to Australia, what's going to happen there? And, as you think more about these kind of legacy applications that people have in their environment, obviously it can become harder, right? So they often don't have natural redundancy, they struggle with replication, and they can be challenging to move into the cloud. And when you do, it can be challenging to do it in a way that's multi-cloud ready or multi-location ready. So that's something that we run into quite a lot as well. As promised, I'm going to give a sneak peek next at what we're actually going to cover in the next webinar and how we can try and help to solve some of these. And then finally, we will answer any questions or anything you have. So you can feel free to keep asking. There are some already, so we'll go through those. But our next webinar, you can sign up in the same way as you did for this. And it's going to be a Snapt engineer session. So we're going to have our engineers on the call. We will be talking about how to actually deploy to multi-cloud, multi-location deployments, right? What are the best practices in those environments? What do we see our clients doing? What are our recommendations? What are some of the pitfalls around there, right? Software design and architecture problems. So we have a lot of DevOps engineers and DevSecOps engineers in our team, and we'll be bringing some of those insights to it. And how do we do it? So obviously, we are a product that enables multi-cloud, but also we ourselves are a multi-cloud consumer. So we'll be looking specifically at how we've architected our environment, how we use different clouds for high availability or geographic locations or things like that, and what some of the challenges, how we overcame them, things like that. So it'll be a much more kind of in the details, in the weeds session. That I think will be quite interesting, especially to people that, a lot of the topics today are resonating with. And ultimately, we'll try and help you to get the benefits and skip the challenges of a multi-cloud organization and application design, right? So aside from questions and answers, that's it from me. Thank you all for listening, and thank you again to Alan. It was great to hear from you. Alan, unless there's anything you want to add in here, I'm going to just go to questions, I think.
Yeah, no, that was very great. Really appreciate it. And you can count me in for the second webinar. That sounds very interesting to me anyway. So we got a few questions that came in. And I want to start with, you had mentioned a customer that you work with that spends multiple $1 million a month on their cloud services. And by sort of watching what's going on with the individual providers that they're using, they can move workloads around and save, upwards of 10%. And like you said, hundreds of thousands of dollars. So behind the scenes, what does it take for an organization that's that advanced? Obviously, you're spending that much money. You have some engineers that are well-trained in how it all works together. But, kind of behind the scenes, can you give us sort of a flavor for what does it take for an organization to be able to manage, monitor, and then act on, those situations?
Yeah, absolutely. Let me do it in two ways. They are a client of ours, but I don't want to drone on necessarily about our component of it. So I'll touch on that, and then I'll touch on their architecture. So we have a couple of clients that do something similar to that. That's probably the largest spend one that hops between clouds, though. And what they do is they have a variety of workloads that are all containerized. So most of their applications, should I say, exist within containers, and they are very easy to scale up and to scale down, right? So they can, if they wanted to manually say, okay, well, I've got 10,000 containers running in AWS. I'm going to scale that down to 5,000 and scale the 10 I had in Azure up to 15,000 or whatever it might be. We also have a bunch of clients, though, that have traditional virtual machine instances, right? Cloud instances like EC2 and things like that. And they will have either auto-scaling groups where they will just scale up based on CPU or memory consumption or things like that. Could be time of day. We have clients that do APIs to lift and shift loads. It might not just be a cost-saving exercise, right? Like your South African data center might, only need a certain amount of capacity in the evening in South African time, for example, things like that. And then you've got the getting the data in. So that's the part we're obviously involved in, right? Selecting the nearest data center for a client to go to, or the most optimal one, and monitoring that kind of traffic and what the peaks are and how much capacity they need and things like that. But really, it's largely around the fact that their application is designed in such a way that it can be scaled out or scaled in by launching more compute or less compute. So they actually went through quite a process to get to that stage. Of reworking a lot of their core application. But that's very common, us seeing that, especially as people move towards Kubernetes or want to embrace it. Then you become naturally more ready for a multi-cloud deployment, if that makes sense. Yeah.
And you mentioned ingress, but data egress is really the gotcha still, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. That's the expensive part that no one talks about, right? But data leaving in the cloud is for a lot of our clients, extremely expensive.
Yeah. So here's another question from an audience member. What are the use cases to modernize applications to multi-cloud? That's kind of broad. See what you can do with that one.
Yeah. Let me try and, so, I can talk from our experience, what we see with clients a lot of the time. We do a lot of work in, I guess, fintech, education, health, those types of markets. So a lot of the time they are very worried about resilience. So they want an application that can run in multiple data centers, multiple cloud locations, multiple countries, things like that. The other thing that I didn't mention, by the way, is that there are a lot of data sovereignty concerns that we see today. So, a company that is servicing American clients may want that data exclusively in America. And that same company may be servicing European clients and want that data warehousing exclusively in Europe. Especially if you do governmental work, things with like patient health information. There are lots of concerns around that, right? From all around the world, from Australia to Europe to America, there are a lot of data sovereignty concerns. So we will often see that people want resiliency or location neutrality, right? They want to be able to run in many locations. And because of that, they will need to adopt this type of strategy. But people are also just generally kind of modernizing legacy applications because they can be very hard to scale. A use case I often use, is of like the need to scale is Zoom, something that we're probably all quite familiar with after the last year. I think in December, you guys can look this number up and don't quote me. I'm just reading this, like I'm just telling you off the back of my head. But in December 2019, Zoom had 10 million active monthly users. By April 2020, they had 350 million. So
that's amazing.
Yeah, right. And they're obviously one of the beneficiaries of all the chaos that's been going on. But it's not uncommon for us to see businesses' requirements go up 10 times, 20 times, in a short period of time, like over a year. And legacy applications don't handle that very well. So I think that's also, a big use case to modernize and be able to use cloud services and things like that in a scalable, burstable fashion, as opposed to just taking your monolithic kind of legacy app that all runs on one VM and just putting that VM in the cloud is obviously, very different and very restrictive to multi-cloud. So that's what I was saying when I was talking about, the dependence challenge where people are dependent on one cloud provider, can also be dependent on one stack, that can be, a legacy solution or something like that.
And, the pandemic drove a lot of demand in a lot of different areas. I mean, I would think that multi-cloud, just the whole notion of multi-cloud would have benefited as companies went about the process of, dealing with the challenges of the pandemic. I mean, did you see anything specifically within your customers regarding?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
The thing is that past the pandemic, work from home and the need to be constantly connected and online from anywhere is not going anywhere, right? I think we can kind of all accept that even as offices open back up, there will be large amounts of staff working remotely and business taking place at random hours and all of those types of considerations. So like concerns about downtime, downtime when it used to mean that like your intranet portal wasn't working, but everyone was in the office, so things were still working was one thing. Downtime now when it means your 15,000 staff all sitting at home and no one could log in all day, and you've lost a significant amount of money is that cost alone could be the cost of a multi-cloud or infrastructure. So there's absolutely, you've seen a lot of that, but then companies have had to scale in ways like they've never had to before, right? Like, I mean, I used the Zoom example, but can you imagine being asked, well, what infrastructure do we need next year? If we're going to have 50 times the capacity or something, and the only way to really solve that is to say, well, we will leverage cloud solutions. And a lot of the time that means leveraging ones that are closest to your clients. You could have very latency sensitive applications like, online gaming is a big market for us. And they're concerned about being, in the state that their players are in, not just on the coast or something like that. And, so that's led to multiple location deployments and things. So, yeah, I think just the massive uptick in online services in the last 2 years has really made people need to leverage what they can get out of multi-cloud.
And one of the most common clouds that are used in multi-cloud deployments. I mean, the usual
it depends on the use case. Sometimes. That's why I say it depends on the use case, because the usual suspects, it's Google Cloud, Azure, and AWS. Those are the big ones we see. And like you rightly say, it's the usual suspects. What you will then typically see is people deploying in 2 of those, maybe 3, for the reasons that I've mentioned. But what we see a lot now as well is that companies might have their production workloads in one cloud and have their pre-production or QC or dev or test environments in another one, right? So we see that a lot with DigitalOcean, Linode, places like that, right? They have large installations with large kind of internet companies, startups, things like that, that have utilized their infrastructure because a lot of the time it can be more affordable or more sensible in the way they deploy it or design it, or things like that. So sometimes it's not just the usual suspects. By way of direct example, we see DigitalOcean a lot as kind of the development cloud.
Interesting. And I think we let's squeeze in one more question here. So here's a question: why not use 2 availability? Good Lord. Why not use 2 availability zones on one cloud provider? I suppose that's...
and it's a good question. You can, and most people do. In fact, no, not can, should. You definitely should. It is much more common for an availability zone to go down than an entire cloud provider to go down. But there are certain things that doesn't cover. It covers most, to be honest with you, realistic. It covers most of your downtime and disaster recovery requirements. An outage that takes out the whole of Azure or GCP is likely to cause so much chaos on the internet that you'll probably not be the front page story on the newspaper. But technically speaking, it is still dependent on one cloud provider who could have a problem with a service that you use. Now that we do see a lot, right? Like we've seen S3 outages across the whole of Amazon, for example, things like that. So you're not technically totally isolated from different clouds, but also you then don't get the benefit of price comparison between them, being able to move workloads between clouds depending on that. A lot of the time, like I say, you might be forced to choose a specific cloud because of the location that they exist in, whereas others do not. Like I mentioned, we're going down to the state level now, right? It's not just countries. So there are those other benefits as well. But at the very least, people should be deploying in multiple availability zones.
Well, and speaking of that, I mean, so is there any kind of a way of gauging sort of the normal cost to swap from a single cloud to a multi-cloud? I mean, that kind of relates to what you were just talking to.
Yeah, I think it depends on how, this is a funny way to say it. It depends on how modern your application stack is. It's not exclusively that point, but I think that's maybe the best way of kind of getting the message across to the audience. The more modern it is, the more likely it is to only need to consume resources and therefore cost when it's in use.
Yeah.
Now, if you don't have that type of design, it can be then twice the price, right?
Yeah. So we have one more audience question come in. We're running up against time here, so I'm going to give you about 70 seconds or so to answer this one. Can you talk about, is federated cloud similar to multi-cloud?
Yes, absolutely, because it's structurally separate, right? Like, so from an architecture point of view, from a what you need to do, management point of view, connectivity, deploying into the different environments, it's basically exactly the same. It's actually a very good point. In the beginning when I say multi-cloud, what I actually mean is XYZ. It is the same. It's exactly when you have a workload that needs to be present in disconnected environments. And by disconnected, I mean the internet is down. I mean, to use the pre-cloud terminology, they're not in the same switch, right?
Yeah.
That's really multi-cloud to me.
Yeah. Well, super helpful, Dave. I learned an awful lot listening to you. Do you have any closing remarks before we turn it back over to Jen?
Only to say, yeah, thank you very much, Alan. It was great. And yeah, I also had got a lot of insights from yours, and am looking forward to, I think, digging in with our engineers on the next session and into how Snapt has designed its architecture and what we see from our clients.
Look forward to it. Jen?
Great. Thank you both. It looks like we are just about out of time. But before we go, I'd like to thank both Alan and Dave for that informative discussion, as well as Snapt for sponsoring today's event. As a reminder, and as both speakers just mentioned, this is the first of a three-part webcast series on enterprise multi-cloud, with our next webcast happening on October 12th at 12 p.m. Eastern. The second parter will cover tips on designing a multi-cloud deployment. And our third and final webcast in our series will be on November 9th at 12 p.m. Eastern as well. And this will offer insight on how to build a crisis-resilient multi-cloud deployment. We hope to see you there.
Thanks, Jen. Good afternoon, everyone.